On this episode of War Docs, we speak with retired Navy captain and cardiothoracic surgeon, Dr. Hassan Tetteh. Dr. Tetteh shares his story of what led him into military medicine and how his career evolved to include specializing in thoracic transplantation, training to be a clinical informatics expert, as well as becoming an author and podcast host. He shares some amazing clinical stories from his deployments on an aircraft carrier at sea, as well as supporting the Second Marine Expeditionary Force in Afghanistan. Hassan also talks about being an author and his focus on the importance of the human touch in the provision of healthcare, and how this element is critical to maintain in the era of increasing automation and technology. Dr. Tetteh provides an insightful assessment of where artificial intelligence currently is being leveraged in healthcare, and where he sees it expanding in the near future, and how it can be used to optimize military and federal medicine. Find out more about Dr. Tetteh and our previous guests on our website, wardocspodcast.com. And make sure you follow War Docs on your preferred podcast platform and subscribe to our War Docs YouTube channel. I'm your host, Dr. Doug Soderdahl, retired Army urologist, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Dr. Wayne Causey, active duty vascular surgeon.
Welcome to War Docs, the military medicine podcast. This show brings you a first-hand, behind-the-scenes look into the mission, unique opportunities, and deployed experiences of the entire military healthcare team. From state-of-the-art hospitals in the United States to the most austere environments across the globe, War Docs has you covered.
Today, we're privileged to welcome retired Navy Captain Dr. Hassan Tetteh to War Docs. Hassan, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Doug. Appreciate the invitation to visit with you and Wayne.
Let's set the stage a little bit for our listeners and get a little bit about your background. Tell us about your background and what motivated you to pursue a medical career.
It all started in a little village town in New York called Brooklyn. That's where I was born and raised as the son of West African immigrant parents. And like many immigrant parents, your child is a success, or at least they think so if they become a doctor or a lawyer. So I was inculcated pretty early on. No one in my family, immediate family, was a doctor. My mom worked as a nurse's aide, and as far as I could remember, I was something that I always wanted to do is be a doctor. And I was fortunate to get to medical school, and I actually joined the Navy after medical school, believe it or not, and that was the result of becoming enamored with junior ROTC. I was in a junior ROTC, Harlem Youth Marine Corps organization when I was in high school, and it was around the time Full Metal Jacket was on the scene, and all of that really just really enticed me. And I was going to join the Marines as a high school student. I was graduating. I was only 17. My mom was going to sign the papers for me. I was going to get her consent, and at the last minute, I changed my mind. My recruiter gave me a little bit of misinformation, told me that I could be a doctor as a Marine, which is not entirely true. And I sort of revisited the military career path after graduating from medical school when the Navy recruiters were around and asked me if I knew anything about the military. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I thought about joining when I was in high school. And the individual that was talking with me said, well, if you become a Navy doc, and at the time I'd already matched in general surgery, so I came in under a program called the Financial Assistance Program. She said, you could be a doc and take care of the Marines. And I said, well, that sounds great. I'll do 4 years and I'll get out. 25 years later, it was quite the experience.
Yeah, I know that story. I had the same thing. I was going to get out as soon as I could, and 30 years gone by, and before I know it, here I am at mandatory retirement. So you began your naval journey as a staff general surgeon at Bremerton up in the Northwest. Right. Can you share some insights from those early days as a general surgeon and working up there? I know Bremerton, I was stationed at Madigan, so just kind of down the road. And Bremerton was not a huge hospital, but you guys had a significant amount of work there. So how was that?
Yeah, well, full disclosure, I didn't spend too much time at Bremerton. It was probably just a few pit stops there and did a few cases, because my true duty assignment was attached to the USS Carl Vinson CVN 70, and I was mainly deployed with her for the large part of the 24 months I was out there, and 19 of those months were actually spent at sea. So whenever I was stateside or shoreside, those were the moments that I got to go to Bremerton. That's an interesting story in itself. So I spent 2 years as a general surgeon, as you just mentioned, and that was not entirely part of the plan. And I think many of our listeners and those of us that have been in the military know that it doesn't always go according to your plan at times. Sometimes it kind of takes a different direction. So when I was a general surgery resident, I really fell in love with cardiac surgery. And in fact, I thought I was going to be a transplant surgeon at one point, but I did my cardiac surgery rotation, and I was hooked ever since I was a first year resident. And that's what I wanted to do. I actually went through the match, and that was just my naiveness, not knowing that the process was a little bit more involved in that. You know, when you're in the FAP program, you don't really have a lot of touch points and a lot of guidance. So nonetheless, I matched in cardiac surgery as a general surgery chief. And I went to have a conversation with the specialty leader in CT surgery just to kind of convince him that I really needed to be a cardiac surgeon. And yeah, I'll never forget, he was very gracious. It was Captain Hemp. And, I actually went to San Diego to visit him. I took a trip from New York all the way out there just to see him. And he was gracious. He picked me up. He took me around. He showed me Balboa's Hospital, had a conversation with me about his experience and how he had to be a general surgeon for a little bit. And he suggested I do a hardship tour. And I said, well, sir, what's that? And he said, well, I think you should go on a ship and be a general surgeon, and that'll be a hardship tour. And that'll give you some more points for the GME process, and they'll maybe allow you to do your fellowship later. And I remember looking at, at Captain Hemp as a lieutenant in the Navy and totally green. And I said, sir, with all due respect, I didn't join the Navy to go on a ship. I don't think he thought that was too funny, but he said, listen, you should definitely do that. It's going to be a good experience for you. It's one of the best experiences I ever had. And true to his word, he was right. I went on board the ship, and she was coming back from a deployment at the time, so I had to get cotted on, and I'll never forget that experience. You know, it was a postage stamp size dot in the ocean somewhere, and we had been flying over the Pacific for what seemed like hours, and we landed on that little postage stamp. And that became my home, like I said, for the next 2 years. I actually extended a year because we were going around the world, and I wanted to be a part of ship's company and do that. But I fully embraced it. I got my surface warfare medical department officer pin. So I stood watch like with everybody else. I learned all about the ship and every aspect of it. And, I did sick call, I did everything plus operate. And it was great. It was a good experience. And I made great friends, and my shipmates from that time are still my friends to this day. In fact, one of my wingmen on the ship was the gentleman that toasted me at my retirement. So, definitely kept in touch with those guys. And up until Afghanistan and some of my deployments to, Africa and Middle East, that was definitely one of the most consequential times in my life.
What was your most challenging case on board ship? Most of our listeners,
Yeah,
we have some surgeons who, understand cases, but maybe not necessarily on a ship.
Well, we were out to sea a lot. I mean, 19 months of deep blue operations, deep blue water operations. And so we spent a lot of time out to sea. And I was a young surgeon. I was very gung-ho about doing cases. So I tried to do anything, lumps and bumps. I did hernias, appies. One of my cases I do remember that was really pivotal during that time, just kind of being a newly minted general surgeon, was the fact that I had a young man who had an appy, appendicitis. We had done a couple of those on the ship while we were underway. So, pretty routine. And this gentleman developed right after induction malignant hypothermia. Many of us in practice never see that at all. We read about it. And many of us have never experienced, what that is like to take care of in real life. And we had that opportunity on the ship. Fortunately, we got him through it, and he did well. But that was pretty memorable because it was one of those experiences that many of us have in the military, where you are, quickly thrown in the deep end, so to speak, literally and figuratively, and you have to figure it out. And you rely on all your training and your team to get you through it. And in that case, that's exactly what we did. I had an excellent nurse anesthetist. I had a really great, surgical tech team, and I had some nurses that were there. We had the whole team rally, and we were able to get the young man through that. And it's also a consequence of our training. We actually trained and had drills for those types of things, especially when we had the downtime. We'd look and make sure we had all the right equipment. If we ever had to run a code, if we ever had, malignant hypothermia, make sure we had the dantrolene and the ice and knew how to use everything, and everyone was up to speed and up to snuff on what to do in case of an emergency. And that's exactly what we did. And we just went into action, and we saved him and got him through that and got him through the case, and he did okay.
So some of our listeners may be hearing the malignant hyperthermia, and I'm just going to give a brief little synopsis. And it's actually an anesthetic complication that
Right,
occurs where a patient is going to sleep, and the anesthetic that's being used, typically an inhaled anesthetic, causes their temperature. So that's why it's called malignant hyperthermia, to go extraordinarily high. It's an
right,
emergency condition. But the rarity of the situation is what is impressive about this, is because if you talk to an experienced anesthesiologist, they're lucky to have, not lucky, they may have only encountered one or two cases throughout an entire career of performing anesthesia. But I'm interested now in what you'd mentioned earlier in your experience in Afghanistan. So now you've moved from the ship to the ground, and you were a trauma surgeon with the Second Marine Expeditionary Force. Share a defining moment from that deployment.
I don't know if there was any one defining moment. There were many consequential and defining moments for sure. One thing that comes to mind right away is when we first arrived at our FOB. So for those of you that are listening, FOB is a forward operating base. We were in a role 2. So here I am, a cardiothoracic surgeon. At this point, I'm fully trained and finished my training. It's been practicing for a few years at National Naval before the integration with Walter Reed, and I got deployed. And I was there with the pretty big medical team, and we were dispersed throughout Helmand Province during that time. It was a pretty kinetic time for the Second MEF and the folks that we were there supporting. And we were detailed, I guess, so to speak, to FOB Edinburgh, one of the FOBs. It was probably the most busiest at that time, and received casualties almost daily. And we had just arrived from Camp Leatherneck, and we had, literally just heloed in, touchdown. And as we were landing, there was a dust off bringing a casualty in. And we were the brand new team. We still had all of our battle gear, and we're trying to get out of everything and drag our bags. And they were in the middle of literally receiving a casualty as we were landing. And it was myself and the orthopedic surgeon that I was with. We had actually a contingent of 3 surgeons, myself, 2 general surgeons, and an orthopod, so 4 surgeons altogether. But he and I, were somewhat invited, if you will, but also encouraged by the team that was there to scrub into this case. And we were preparing to do that, but as they were bringing the gentleman into the tent, we saw this mangled body with no legs, and the tourniquets wrapped up very high on the thigh. That was many years ago, but I could see that picture if I closed my eyes vividly as if it was yesterday. And what was wrong, what was visceral, and what was consequential, and I guess also a defining moment, as you asked, Wayne, is that was the first time for me, and I think for all of our team members, even those that had deployed in Iraq and other places before, to see a casualty in its state like that, a gentleman that was, literally just injured. And now he was right before us, because, we were there as a role 2 to obviously temporize, stop the bleeding, save a life, and get him on to the next echelon of care. And in that moment, we had just landed, after spending weeks of travel, from the States and through Leatherneck and a lot of dwell time. And then, immediately as we land, we see this. And it literally felt like the next 7 months were just like that. Like there was never a real long period of downtime. It was just very high tempo, just like that. So that moment was defining in the sense that it really prepared us, I think, at least me psychologically, and I know my colleagues as well, that where we were entering into was a very kinetic, very difficult, and very challenging time. And the stakes were very high, obviously, because, the mission there was very important. And the folks that we were supporting and taking care of really relied on us. And it was because they knew that we were there for them when they got injured. They were able to go out every day beyond the wire and do what they needed to do. Now, at that moment, when we landed and that happened, I didn't appreciate all that, but I came to appreciate that over the ensuing months, if that makes sense, in a really consequential way. But there were many like that because, like I said, almost on a daily, if not every other day basis, we were receiving casualties just like that, and sometimes most often even worse.
So you did finally get to do what you wanted to do when you were in high school, when you went to that recruiter. You got to take care of Marines. How was that, taking care of the second MEF?
Like I said, all those things that I mentioned, it was challenging. It was definitely um, difficult. And it was also hard to reconcile at times because, we were taking care of individuals that you knew, and, anybody could know just by looking at the injuries and thinking about what we were doing to save them at the time, that these individuals were going to have their lives forever changed. And they were all young. And you're talking 17, 18, 19-year-old, kids, really, obviously not kids because of what they were doing, but their lives are going to be forever changed. And what I appreciated, because at that point I already had the arc of a few deployments. I'd already been overseas. I already had the experience on the ship, but more importantly, I had my time at the hospital. Basically the tertiary care center where we saw individuals that had gone through that process, and we were seeing them for complications or follow-on surgeries or just post-care. And when you see them in that state, you don't necessarily appreciate, unless you've been downrange and you now can see at the time of injury what their journey has been. And so I believe I felt like I had seen that full stage. But to answer your question about what that was like, and what it meant to support Second MEF in particular in the Marines, it was a proud moment in the sense that we were doing something that was very, very awesome. Not only were we saving lives, but like I said, our presence was what gave, I think, those individuals, especially at Second MEF, the confidence and also the security to go out and do their mission, because they knew that someone was going to be there to take care of them if something happened to them. And many of them adopted a posture of, like, not so much if something happened to me, but when something happened to me, because it was that kinetic, it was that busy, and quite frankly, it was that gruesome.
One of the things that our listeners know is that every military career in medicine seems to be very different in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that makes your career unique is that your expertise is in thoracic transplantation. And first, why don't you tell our listeners exactly what that job entails, what the training pathway is, and also let's talk a little bit about what is a heart and lung organ recovery team, and you can maybe define for us the STAR team.
Yes, you're right in saying that every military physician's or military medicine officer, medical officer's career is different and defined by, a myriad of things: their training, their experiences, their exposure, their deployments. I think in my case, I was fortunate in that many of these things had synergy and connection. So you're right in saying that I was trained formally as a cardiac surgeon, but because of where I trained at University of Minnesota, the sort of mecca of heart surgery, but also heart transplantation and lung transplantation, if not all transplantation, I had a huge exposure to that discipline. And I like to joke and muse that when you go to University of Minnesota, you leave as a general surgeon or whatever your specialty is, either loving or hating transplant, because you've been exposed to it so much that there's no way you can kind of be in between about it. You're gonna either love it or you're gonna never want to see it again in your life. And in my case, I fell into the camp that really loved it and embraced it. And when I finished my training at Minnesota, I had the opportunity to spend a bit of time in Boston at the Brigham, sort of refining that a little bit and also doing some more adult cardiac. So by the time I arrived at National Naval at that time, I was fully convinced that I was in a position and fully enthusiastic about starting a heart failure program for the National Naval Hospital. And of course, that did not come to fruition for a myriad of reasons, notwithstanding just, there were a lot of other centers in the area that were doing that and doing it in higher volume and with greater infrastructure. But what that did afford me and that experience of that training, getting to know the other transplant surgeons, particularly the thoracic transplant surgeons in the country and those that I trained with, is when I arrived in the area, I had a great myriad of mentors from my training in general surgery as well as thoracic surgery and a time at the Brigham that introduced me to the surgeons that were practicing in the area and basically in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And over time, I got to learn and work with I learned from and work with all of the thoracic transplant surgeons at Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland, MedStar, and Inova, which are the four big centers that do those types of cases. And that was tremendously enriching for me professionally because it gave me another dimension of not only training, but exposure to something that I really loved. Why is that important? Because there was a case that I can also think of another defining moment in Afghanistan, where all of that training, all of that experience, and that discipline came into bear in a way that was consequential and I believe life-saving for an individual who happened not to be a Marine, believe it or not, but an Afghan child. And what I mean by that is, when you do transplant, it's one of these unpredictable, happens anytime where you have to go out and recover an organ, and when you come back, you're typically up many hours after bringing the organ back, putting the organ in, whether it's a heart or a lung, and then of course taking care of that patient. And I had been faced with that, throughout my training, and then in my capacity working with some of the different centers while I was here at National Naval. The unpredictability of it, the fact that you have to go out and often recover organs with other individuals you've never worked with before, going to a foreign hospital you've never worked at before, and working with instruments that are not your instruments, and sort of getting along with other people that had other agendas, and maybe an anesthesiologist you never worked with, and still having to be somewhat the leader in that whole morass, because as the heart recovery surgeon, the heart's the first organ to go, and you need to make sure that everybody else is not compromising the heart's ability to be viable and be transplantable. So it's a lot you have to keep an eye on. And of course, you don't necessarily understand or appreciate how invaluable that training comes into play until you actually have to use it in something other than transplant. And that's exactly what happened to me in Afghanistan. And what happened was, this was midway through the deployment. There was a call that came in, and they were like, "We need to speak to Commander Tetteh." I was a commander at the time. And so I get on the horn, and I'm talking, and it was our colleagues over at Bastion Hospital, which was at Leatherneck, and they're like, "We need you to come over and help us out with a case. It's a thoracic case," and I happen to be the only thoracic surgeon in the area, even though I was at the FOB and not at Bastion, and at the time deployed. And so I was a bit perplexed, because I was thinking to myself, well, it's not, necessarily close. The only way to get over there is by helo. And literally, as I was listening to the case being conveyed to me, I could hear the helicopters and the dust off coming in. And they were like, "We had a child that had shrapnel to the chest, and it looks like there's a bullet lodged in the heart, and the child is unstable. And we don't have a thoracic surgeon. The team here is getting started, but we need you to come right away." And I immediately sort of started thinking about a whole lot of things, notwithstanding how am I going to get there in time to save what sounds like an unstable situation, or even contribute in any way that's going to help. And then, of course, the other things that went through my mind, the fact that there's not bypass. There's no capability of putting a child or anybody on bypass out in the field. If there is in fact a true injury to the heart, as soon as you make any attempt to open, whatever tamponade or bleeding that is controlled right now will simply, be uncontrolled, and there will be no way to really salvage that. So all of those things are kind of running through my mind. But just like I said, in the civilian world, where you get the call and you got to get on some sort of aircraft sometimes, or some sort of mode of transportation, and go to a foreign place, work with a team you've never worked with before, and do something that's pretty consequential, like recover the heart or the lung and bring it back, and make sure that everything's going to be okay for the patient that's in dire need. That was somewhat of the same scenario in my mind. I was here now flying across the desert, to go to Bastion, where, I had toured at one point, but didn't know the team there. I was going to arrive, and the case was already started, which it was, and have to work with a team I never worked with before, and never, dealt with any of the instruments there, and knew that I didn't have a lot of information to work with, and didn't really have a lot of support or backup. And here it was. I got plopped right into that scenario. And I immediately just started thinking about all the cases I had done in transplant, where this was just like old hat for me. And I came in, and there was a team there, and we worked together, and we got the kid's chest open, and got the right exposure, relieved the tamponade. Unfortunately, the injury wasn't so severe that it was causing more sanguination than what we were able to control. And clearly, you had a good anesthesiologist and a team there that were supporting the child all throughout the entire endeavor. And yeah, then we got the exposure we needed. We got the control of the bleeding, and we were able to get the child out of that. And that was a case where I say it was a defining moment, because there was no way that when we landed, or when I landed in Afghanistan, if someone said, well, you're going to have to take care of a child with a bullet wound to the heart, that I would ever imagine that could happen. I would have been like, there's no way. How did that happen? How could that even occur? And sure enough, it did. And it's another consequence of, I think, why you guys have the program you have, Award Docs, is that you have to be prepared for the unexpected. And in this case, that was the unexpected. And fortunately, the training, my experience, and those years of doing transplant for me absolutely created an environment for me that I was comfortable in, and I was, ready for. And I felt like, there was a culmination of all of the stuff that I'd done before that prepared me for this moment.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. And you were there for a reason. And you had that training that you were able to rely on. And that's just a great story. I want to shift gears just a little bit. And one of the other things you did while you were on active duty was that you really got involved in informatics. And tell us a little bit about what is informatics and how it impacts medicine, especially military medicine, since you were in uniform when you did that extra training.
One of the other things that I think is unique about, military medicine, and certainly serving as an officer for many years, is as you move up in ranks, your responsibilities change. You're always going to be defined as a doctor, and always going to be relied on to do the work of your discipline, and that was always certainly the case. But as I had an opportunity to be exposed to some executive medicine and some of the opportunities that were coming online for the Defense Health Agency and military health system writ large, it became apparent to me that we were moving into a different era, the information age, if you will, of electronic health records, which obviously the military had always led in. But, here we were thinking about getting an off-the-shelf system that was largely promulgated by many of our civilian hospitals and colleagues. And I had an opportunity to meet an individual many years ago that told me about a clinical discipline that was burgeoning and on the horizon. And he said that it was going to have a board certification and be a clinical subspecialty. And I said, interesting. What is that? He said, clinical informatics. And I said, well, that's interesting. What is that all about? He said, well, it's taking administration, clinical uh, management and leadership and creating a discipline for that. And I thought to myself, I said, well, that sounds like just doing healthcare. You're supposed to take information and have management and also leadership and you take all of those things and it should help you to do your job better. But what struck me about what he was sharing with me with this new discipline called clinical informatics was the fact that we were going to be using data and technology to help physicians do their job better. And for me, that was a natural extension of cardiac surgery because our specialty, our discipline, years and years ago, back in the 80s and 90s, had started the Society of Thoracic Surgeons database. As cardiac surgeons, it's very hard for you to compromise and certainly any of your mistakes in the operating room, unfortunately, become very clear in the outcomes of your patients. And cardiac surgeons for many years had been self-reporting and creating this database and this repository of information to help create better standards and outcomes for each other. And so it seemed to me that clinical informatics was really what cardiac surgeons had been doing all along, at least what I'd been doing all along, which is taking data, evaluating our outcomes, and then looking for the things that make our outcomes better and improving upon them. And then, of course, taking technology and integrating it into the practice of what we do, which is take care of patients in very complicated, very high risk, and very difficult procedures, whether it's bypass, whether it's transplant, whether it was assist devices, all the things that I had been doing, throughout my career and seeing how the evolution of cardiac surgery had been employing not only technology, but data and information to create better outcomes for our patients in increasingly complex cases and patients with more comorbidities and all those things. So I was all on board. I was like, this is great. I'll get another board certification. And I didn't realize how consequential it was going to be, but that's the same individual. I remember when I passed my boards in clinical informatics, we had a dinner together and he had mentioned to me and another colleague of mine that had been studying with me to take the exam and get through all of the prerequisites. He told me that this is going to be one of the most consequential things you ever do in your career, your military career and your medical career. And I literally, I laughed. I was like, what are you talking about? I said, I'm a cardiac surgeon. This is just something I just, thought was kind of interesting and I just wanted to do. And literally within a year later, I was recruited and fortunate to be at the right place at the right time to be selected as a chief medical informatics officer for the Navy. Now that would have never have happened without that, that specialty and that board certification in informatics, but also taking the time to learn about informatics and how it could be applied to our system and our healthcare system. And now, of course, there's a burgeoning specialty in informatics and now in AI and chief medical informatics officers and others have been contributing greatly to the whole ecosystem of healthcare. So he was right. It was consequential, and it definitely afforded me a great path to contribute in a very meaningful and impactful way in the organization.
So you mentioned informatics and you said AI, artificial intelligence. In your experience studying how artificial intelligence technologies will impact the delivery of healthcare in the future, how would you rate the current status of leveraging AI in medical care, and what are the major breakthroughs you foresee coming in the next several years?
Well, that's a really good question. We could spend hours talking about the answer to that question, but I will succinctly say this. The informatics part of my training and sort of experience in my career was, I think, one of the gateways for me into artificial intelligence. And what I mean by that is I become board certified in informatics. And I had this experience as the chief medical informatics officer. And in between that time, I had an opportunity to go to National War College at NDU. I had a rotation, or I guess an assignment there. I spent 2 years at National Defense University. The first year I was a command surgeon on campus, which is basically the doc, and I got to take care of the sort of physical and healthcare related issues on campus. as well as be an advisor to the leadership and also participate in the capstone program as a physician. But the next year, I got to go to school, and with a chance encounter with General Powell at the time, I was able to convince my leadership to allow me to go to National War College instead of Eisenhower, which is usually where the docs and the nurses went. And that was really impactful. And Wayne, it was important for me because when I went to the National War College and I was the only doc in my graduating class, I was exposed to a myriad of individuals, officers and leaders in the military that were across a span of different disciplines. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me was meeting a lot of my colleagues in the intel community and learning from them how they were using data. And this was well before ChatGPT, before AI was at the zeitgeist and at the tip of everyone's tongue. This is before people really knew what AI was. And they were using algorithms, they were using advanced analytics to gain insight into the data they were collecting. And it just, again, it seemed like an intuitive thing to me that this was an opportunity to be able to use data, apply information that we were gleaning from patients, and make better decisions, not only in healthcare, but in the application of how we take care of patients. And I convinced some of the academic leadership at the institution to allow me to work on an independent project in artificial intelligence and military medicine. And I wrote a thesis on that. And that was really important for me because it gave me, time, space, freedom, and also resources in the community that was there, but also my mentors that were my academic mentors to really get access to information that was quite important in terms of putting together a philosophy and also this academic work that showed me a path that was probably a little bit before its time of how AI was going to fundamentally change healthcare. And that's how I would answer your question. So the way I take all of that in and now answer your question is that AI is going to be the general purpose technology of our era that absolutely redefines and reshapes how healthcare is delivered in not only in the United States, but in the world. And I'm convinced of that. And it's going to happen at a pace and an accelerated pace, unlike anything we've ever seen before. And the caveat I would put is that AI is a tool, just like any other tool has been. But if you think of all the tools that we've used in healthcare, whether you're talking about the stethoscope that took 30 years to adopt after Linnaeus, invented it and tried to tell everyone this is a better way of listening and evaluating the heart, or you think about Pasteur or Lister and all those people that tried to promulgate, antisepsis in the OR, and it still took decades. This is going to be one of those innovations that rapidly changes healthcare and the way we practice and deliver healthcare now and in the future. Just because there are so many things that are happening in and around this space right now, and I've been very enthusiastic about espousing these super forces that I think are going to impact healthcare, and in them are, of course, AI and data. So you have AI and data, you have a massive amount of investment, you have computing power that you never had before. You have algorithms that not only are more accessible to people, but algorithms that can actually write algorithms. And so that's far more in advance than where we were at decades ago. And probably the final super force I would mention is just people. So whether we want to or not, meaning we in the medical community, the doctors and nurses, even the healthcare administrators, want to control or contain this technology, we won't be able to, because the private sector, consumers, patients are going to demand and expect more because there's a potential for more. There's a potential now to literally have access to all the information you need to take care of a patient, if whether they're taking care of or trying to deal with a cancer, whether or not they're trying to deal with an infection, whether or not you're trying to control or monitor whether the next pandemic's going to come and where that outbreak's going to happen. We have access now to information that can help with all of those types of decisions in a way that was never possible before. And you have a critical mass of people that are accessing all that information and those tools and that technology.
Sometimes technology is hard to adopt. We still have residents carrying around pagers when they could get near instantaneous responses by mobile phone communication. So you're right. It takes a generation.
So one of the things that, our listeners may not be aware of your, Renaissance man career, you're also an author and have written several books. One, The Art of Human Care, Gifts of the Heart. And I know that you're involved in a book now with talking about AI and healthcare. Going to this concept of the art of human care, how do you define human care? And what do you want readers to take away from reading that book?
That's something I came up with, a concept. Obviously, I didn't make up art, human, or care, but putting them together in this way was probably something that I like to think was a bit novel. And it was the result of being invited actually to be the white coat ceremony speaker at my alma mater. And years ago, actually almost 10 years ago, if not more. And as you can imagine, and I think for those of us that are listening that have gone through med school, the white coat ceremony is a pretty big deal. It's when first year medical students get in sort of formally indoctrinated into the specialty of healthcare, and they get adorned with a short white coat to signify the belonging of this new professional relationship that they're now entering for hopefully the rest of their life. And most times when they call for a white coat speaker, it's usually some Nobel laureate or someone that has a lot of gray hair and a lot of wisdom. And so I clearly thought they made a mistake when they invited me, like I said, over a decade ago to my alma mater. And it was probably one of the greatest opportunities I've ever had to really think critically about, what I was that I was going to share and stay and impart to an audience. And I knew that, for me, it was a huge responsibility because I felt like the generation of physicians, they're at a crossroads right now, and this was a decade ago, so this is a long time ago, but even more so now, where you have all this technology, you have all of this information. You also have a patient population that has access to information in a way that they never had before. So you think about, at least in my mind, decades ago, when you go to the doctor was this all omniscient person. He or she knew everything. There was no Google, unless you really had, a wealth of experience and understood science. There's no way you could read a medical textbook and make any sense of it. So when someone told you the diagnosis, you relied on that individual to not only give you the diagnosis, but then to give you an explanation of what it was and what were the opportunities to take care of this and so forth. So this is a completely different time now. I mean, I think many of our listeners have probably experienced, whether they're doctors, nurses, or even just, in healthcare, experienced situations where they themselves or they've accompanied a loved one to a physician with a readout or a printout of what they think their condition is before they even talk to the doctor. This is a really strange time. So I was thinking about how do I convey to this next generation of new physicians what it means to be a doctor, and what it means to care for people. And so, like I said, I thought about this and I worked on this, delivering this talk probably for a good 6 months. And I came up with this concept of caring for patients, which is probably the most important thing that we do as physicians, outside of all of the technology, outside of all the information, and really trying to impress upon them that they had this awesome responsibility and opportunity to change the world one patient at a time. That was sort of my message I wanted to convey to them. And then it was a matter of like, how do I convey that message to them? Because it's one thing to tell someone that they could do that, but then how? How do they do that? And I came up with these 3 principles, and that's what the art of human care is all about. And those 3 principles were purpose, personalization, and partnership. And the purpose part came from me being a patient and recognizing and realizing that when I was an undergrad, I almost died with a terrible infection, bacterial meningitis. And before I was a doctor, before I was even, someone that had an undergrad degree, I was deathly ill on death's doorstep. Had a tube in every orifice of my body, spent 2 weeks in the ICU, and this doctor took care of me. And I wanted to impart to the students that if they took care of their patients the way this particular doctor took care of me, and they embodied these three principles of purpose, personalization, and partnership, that they could in fact change the world. And I kind of used me as an example. So here I was in undergrad with this terrible diagnosis. I just come back from an interview for medical school, actually, for Johns Hopkins. And I thought I got in and I was really excited about it. And a week later, I get really sick and I go to the hospital. And the doctor learned about my wanting to be a doctor from my friends because I wasn't able to talk. I was totally out of it. And when I was leaving the hospital, I remember he came to me with a textbook and he showed me, my diagnosis. It was Harrison's. And he said, "You had this. You had bacterial meningitis." But he remembered and kind of, came to share with me this understanding that he knew what my purpose was. And I knew what my purpose was. My purpose at that point was to be a doctor, and I wanted to live. And that gave me a reason for living. And I've seen this in my own practice with patients that I take care of, especially, very complicated heart patients, that if they have a purpose, like they want to go on a cruise, they want to see their kids graduate from college, or they want to see their grandkids finish school, or just go on a trip with them, they have this undeniable desire and passion for living. And so I shared that with them in this story. And then I talked about personalization, and I talked about how this doctor, an ER doctor, mind you, came up to the pediatric ward, because that's where I was, 2 weeks after I had been admitted through the ER, to come see me on the floor. That's unheard of. What ER doctor goes to see a patient once they triage him out of the ER? But he cared so much that he came to talk to me about that, and he personalized this story about, this is what you had. And he even gave me a little quiz. He said, "I heard you wanted to be a doctor." And I said, "Yeah, it's true." And he said, "Well, I have a test for you. And if you pass this test, I'll let you know if you're going to be a good doctor." And he said, "What's 2 + 2?" I said, "It must be a trick question." I said, "It's 4." And he said, "You're going to make an excellent doctor." And I thought to myself, wow, that was so cool. Like he did that. And I shared that story with the students. I said, he took the time to really come and give me this, like, very personal, very, deliberate, moment where he made me feel like I could do anything, even though I hadn't been accepted and I didn't, I almost died. And then the last part of it was partnership. And I shared with them how nothing happens without a partnership. Nothing great happens without a partnership. And, you heard me, as I was telling Dwayne, about the consequential and the defining moments in Afghanistan, on the ship, and all throughout my career. The things that we did in the desert, and thinking about, that very first patient that we saw when we landed, the child in Afghanistan, and every patient in between, and all the ones that I've taken care of since, I shared with them that we took care of those patients and we got them out of those moments and out of those situations, out of those life, like, threatening situations, only through partnership and teamwork. There was no way that any of us, no matter how great a surgeon we were going to be able to take care of any of those injured Marines without a whole myriad of partners and teamwork. The dust-off pilots, the nurses, the corpsmen that were carrying the injured with the gurney through the tent. The people that would clean up the tent after. Everybody that was involved, from the CAPT all the way back to getting them back to tertiary care. I mean, there's a whole, and I shared that. I shared those stories about what we did in the desert, and I made them understand and appreciate that the same thing happens in hospitals every day. When you're in the operating room as a cardiac surgeon, you are not doing it all by yourself. You may feel like you are, but you never do. You have to rely on everybody, anesthesia, perfusion, and that whole team to make the impossible possible. And so that's really where the art of human care came from. It was really a myriad of me melding all of the experience that I'd had, not only as a patient, but as a doctor, to convey to the students that in their new profession, no matter where they are in their training, they're always going to have an opportunity to make a connection with their patient. And as long as they kept in mind that each patient has a purpose, and if they could help that patient find a purpose, and they could personalize their care, and they relied on the partnership that's always necessary to really get a patient to a total state of health, that, they were going to be able to make a big difference. And then finally, I kind of punctuated everything by saying, that doctor saved my life. And it's because of that I'm here talking to you, and hopefully impressing upon you and inspiring you to go out and change the world. So that's really what it was all about. And I was really disappointed in my delivery, Doug, when I gave this speech, because I did something I never really do, is that I had been so very careful and deliberate with my words that I was actually reading the speech, and I didn't give it with the passion and sort of the gravitas that I wanted to give. But since I had all this content and I thought it was really good and I had good feedback, I thought I'd make a book out of it, and I eventually did. And fortunately, a few years later, I got invited to come back and give the speech again. And this time I had internalized it, had written the book, and I think I delivered it with a lot more passion and zest. But you know, it's been something that's been a bit of a passion project for me, and I've written a few books within the series of The Art of Human Care. I have a mentor and a book coach in Jack Canfield, who is one of the co-authors and co-founders of Chicken Soup for the Soul. So in that genre, it's been my desire to have The Art of Human Care be something akin to that. So that's what The Art of Human Care is.
You're the founder and CEO of Human Care Technologies. Can you tell us a little bit more about this organization and some of the current projects you're working on that might benefit military service members and their families?
Sure. Yeah. So obviously, the human care part comes from all my stories in the books. The technology part comes from the fact that the last 5 years of my military career were fortunately spent at, you know, what I regard as the pinnacle of the Department of Defense at the Pentagon. And I was fortunate to get recruited after a stint as the Chief Medical Informatics Officer to be the inaugural warfighter health mission chief at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, a newly established organization at the time that got stood up in 2018. And when I got there, you know, we had a huge mandate. The organization was charged with taking AI and transforming the department through AI. And you know, the leadership deemed that one of the domains that was ripe with opportunity as well as with challenges was health, was warfighter health. And I was able to be a part of that organization and recruit a team of folks that helped me get technology and bring to bear solutions to address some of the problems that we had using AI. And that experience was really important to me because not only did we field AI solutions and implement them at the point of care, but we also scaled and we validated them, and we showed that they made impact and difference. And this was also during the time of the pandemic. You know, we actually developed a platform called Project Salus to help inform public health officials and Northcom on where they could deploy and where they should deploy resources, because we developed an algorithm that could predict where the outbreaks of cases were going to be and sort of act accordingly. So human care technology is my attempt as I transition now to the civilian world to take all that experience and bring it to bear in the civilian sector, because the experience was invaluable. It's kind of like you know, when you study being a doctor or study being a nurse or study being any kind of professional, and then you actually do the work. It's a completely different experience and education you get. And I feel that theoretically, I learned a lot about AI when I was at the War College and through my clinical informatics training, but I got to experience it firsthand and implement it at scale when I was the Warfighter Health Mission Chief. And that experience was invaluable. It was like getting a PhD in applied AI. And we are right now helping organizations bring their technology into the healthcare space because lots of technologists don't have a way to on-ramp their technology. So we're helping to make those transitions possible for some innovators. And we're also working with my colleagues on some applications that are assisting veterans as they transition. So it was pretty traumatic for me to go through the transition process, like many veterans when they're getting out of the military, especially when they're going through the evaluation system and their claims and things like that. And you know, I think there's lots of room for improvement there and lots of holes that we can fill. And we're using AI to do that with large language models, with applications that can help assist with the claim process. And provide a little bit more support for veterans as they're transitioning through a really critical time in their life and career.
I had a chance to listen to your inaugural podcast with Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan and hear you talk about, kind of that exact, thing you just described. And I remember when I went through the transitioning from active duty to the civilian world, it really depended on who you knew and what just fell in front of you. There was no real central guide. And so having something that everyone can just say, hey, I'm 18 months out. What exactly should I be doing? And, the AI program tells you. I think that's an absolutely great thing and something that people that are transitioning from active duty will benefit from. Tell us about that podcast. I know that that was your inaugural episode. What do you got planned?
Thank you for sharing that, Doug. And you're right. I'm glad you're validating what I believe is true. I haven't gone through that process myself and realizing here I am a physician, a cardiac surgeon, a pretty senior officer, having a myriad of challenges going through what should be a pretty simple process because we've been in this organization all our life. We have medical records and things allegedly documented that should help facilitate, but as you know, it's not that easy. And I think to myself, like, what happens to a young sailor, Marine, airman that doesn't have that resource? They don't have that rank. They don't have the sophistication to navigate the health system. I mean, they're probably at a loss. And fortunately, I came out of the military, relatively healthy, all things considered. But I know many others that haven't and that are not. And just imagining how they must be challenged and really at a disadvantage to navigate the system and be able to obtain the resources and the support that they need for the rest of their life to live a good life. It gives me a lot of passion and also a lot of motivation to get this right and to improve that. But with respect to the podcast, that is a result of a partnership I have with Forbes Books. Right now, I'm working on another book. It's called Smarter Healthcare with AI, and again, kind of the subtitle is somewhat in flux right now, but basically harnessing the examples of the military to improve healthcare. But Smarter Healthcare with AI as a book and as a project has been something I've been working on now for almost a year. And the podcast is a way to bring some of that book content to life and also interview and engage with what I regard as leaders in the field of AI and sort of shine a light of how AI is impacting and can impact healthcare and allow us to deliver smarter healthcare using AI. So General Shanahan, not only was he my boss and the inaugural director of the JAIC, but he's someone that I learned a ton from and regarded as a phenomenal leader. And it was really an honor to have him be on the podcast and have him share some of his insights, not only on AI in general, but AI and national security, and also his thoughts on how AI can impact healthcare and give us an opportunity to deliver smarter healthcare.
What do you want people to remember about your military career?
That's a good question. So it's again one of those things that I got to think about quite a bit. Despite kind of wanting to just sail off into the sunset without any fanfare and hoopla, I was convinced by one of my wingmen, Navy guy, that I should have a ceremony when I retired. And he said, "You're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for your family." And he was right. And I'm glad I did not rely on my first impression and just kind of do nothing. But as I memorialized that time and sort of capstoned it, I thought to myself that, if I were to be asked that question, and so this is sort of unprovoked, but Wayne, you asked the question anyway about, how do I want my military career to be remembered, or how do I want to reflect on it? My military career, I would like to have it be known and defined as a time of great service to a nation, and those 25 years were really important, but they were consequential. I'd like to be remembered for being a leader, um, in addition to serving. I like to be remembered as a healer because I do believe that I did that as best as I could. I like to be remembered as a teacher as well because I got to teach a lot throughout my career, not only in the medical capacity, but whenever I had the opportunity to engage with my colleagues and those that I was serving with, and I learned a lot from those individuals as well. And I'd like to, sort of encapsulate all that and think that, in addition to serving and the healing and to leading and to teaching, that I created a great impact on the organization and hopefully the nation in turn. And that, ultimately, my time of service was an inspiration to others that may look back and learn about my time as a naval officer.
We've been speaking with retired Navy Captain Dr. Hassan Tetteh on War Docs. Hassan, thanks again for sharing your experiences and your insights with us. And thank you for your service to the nation. And best of luck with all the projects that you're involved in currently.
Oh, well, thank you, Doug. Thank you, Wayne. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm so honored and really humbled to be able to share my experience with War Docs and the community.
Thank you for listening to War Docs. We sure hope you enjoyed it. War Docs is a nonprofit organization supported by donations from listeners like you. Please follow and subscribe to our show on whatever platform you consume your podcasts, and rate and review this episode, and share the show with your contacts on social media. Find out more information about our show, our guests, and how to become a member of Team War Docs on wardocspodcast.com. Thank you for your support. If you like war stories and medical drama, War Docs has you covered. Spread the word.